Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Hope you guys have been enjoying these. I'm really excited. The weather's starting to get better here in Ohio, and very soon I'm going to be making some plans for historic site videos. That really is what my passion is, and these reaction videos are what fuel the channel to be able to do what my passion is, which is to go out and see some of these sites and to be able to take you along for the journey. So we're going to continue to do that mix of those two things, and if that's the kind of thing you like to see, historical content where we can learn from each other, where we can have conversations, we can grow as historians, grow as people who love these topics and love learning about them, then please, before you do anything else, before you watch the rest of this video, hit that subscribe button. Thank you to everybody who's been doing that. This is a series that has been requested repeatedly from me to react to, and I'm going to dive into one of them today. This is Atun-shei Films. Their channel has a series called Checkmate Lincolnites, where they attempt to debunk what they see as misconceptions about the American Civil War. I have not watched any of them. I've looked at what the topics are for each of them, so I have a fairly good idea of what they're talking about, but I don't know where they're going with this. I don't know what side they're going to take or where I'm going to find myself agreeing or disagreeing with what they say. But as always, I'll put the link in the description for the original content creator so you can go and check them out, subscribe, give them a like and a comment on the original video. Let's dive into, was it really the War of Northern Aggression?
Why did the North invade the South in 1861? Was it because they hated slavery?
No, it was to save the Union.
Checkmate, Lincolnites!
So that's true. Whatever the war ended up becoming about, in the beginning, Lincoln's sole war aim was to save the Union. That was how he sold this to the American people, and that was what he was pursuing. It had nothing at all to do with slavery on the northern end. Different story on the South. It's much more complicated.
The program where we pulverize the outrageous slander so often leveled upon us by carpet-bagging types who seek to besmirch the reputation of our great and glorious country, the Confederate States of America. Tonight, we examine the pettifoggery, hypocrisy, and tyranny of our northern brethren, the meddling Yankee.
So I'll say this right off the bat as he talks about the Confederate States of America, something that was really important to Lincoln. He did not recognize the Confederacy, and that was a key distinction, because all along the argument from the South was that they were a separate nation and were entitled to all of the rights of a separate nation. And that included any negotiated peace settlement that would come out of the war. Whereas Lincoln argued all along that the Confederacy did not exist, that there were rebels, armed rebels within those states, but those states were still a part of the Union. They still were under the laws of the United States. It just happened to be that there were armed rebels within those states.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you say something just before? I simply could not hear you over the sweet sound of victory.
Okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Just because abolition wasn't a primary Northern war aim doesn't change the fact that the South unequivocally seceded to preserve slavery. South Carolina, for example.
South Carolina seeked succession from the Union first for reasons that are debated upon.
Slavery.
Debated upon? What was Lincoln's reaction? Violate constitutional law and did multiple acts of war against a state that by law should have been able to succession from the Union.
To succession from the Union. All right, so this is the ongoing argument forever and ever and ever, is why did the South secede? And a lot of people, especially conservative people, and I'm conservative, a lot of people argue it was states' rights. Yes and no. It was the states' right to preserve their laws concerning slavery. That's a fact. That does not mean that that's how everybody in the South saw it. By and large, outside of the Deep South, where you're talking about Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Georgia, South Carolina, the vast majority of people in the South did not own slaves. That's just a fact. And I think Mississippi is the only state that approached anywhere near something like a significant percentage of white people who owned slaves. I think for most of the rest of the South, it was 10-15% of families owned at least one slave. So the vast majority of people in the South did not own slaves. And so the vast majority of people who enlisted in the army in the South they were not fighting for slavery. But it's very, very clear that the political leadership in the South, the people who made the decisions to secede, it was about slavery for them. Jefferson Davis was one of the wealthiest slave owners in Mississippi. His whole family built their wealth on slavery. So for the politicians, it absolutely was. For the people who were running the Confederate government, it was about slavery. And the states' rights issue was slavery. That doesn't mean that those people didn't legitimately believe in the idea of states' rights, but it was about the state's right to have slavery.
In response to the actions of the president, which was tyrannical.
Dude, South Carolina seceded before Lincoln was even inaugurated. Jefferson Davis was sworn in as president a full 6 days before Lincoln was.
In any event, slavery was never at the forefront of the Union reason for fighting. Most Southern states and generals joined the CSA after Lincoln, without approval from Congress, raised an army of 75,000 to invade the South.
Which he did on April 15th, 1861, right after the attack on Fort Sumter.
And in so doing...
And that was intentional on Lincoln's part. Lincoln, for all of the way in which we view him as the benevolent leader, the wise leader who was struck down and martyred for his country, Lincoln was an incredibly brilliant politician. He may be the most brilliant politician we've ever had in this country that has become president. Brilliant politician. He knew what to do and how to do it, and he knew what strings to pull and when. He knew how to bend the law when he needed to, and he absolutely bent the Constitution completely out of shape to win the war. But he wanted the South to strike first. And he even said in his first inaugural address, he put it on them. He said, listen, in your hands is the momentous issue of civil war, not in mine. He was telling them, I am not going to start a war with the South. If it happens, it'll be because the South started it. And when they did, he jumped on the chance and called for volunteers to put down the rebellion.
He alienated the 4 states that were still holding out for a compromise in the spring of '61. The North was the only party calling for troops. As Virginia Governor Fletcher said, you have chosen to inaugurate civil war. The Southern states never had any intention of invading the North. We didn't need to.
Do you know what the seceded states were up to for the 4 months before Fort Sumter?
Chilling. Yearning for freedom from Yankee tyranny.
Building an army.
Well, not quite. January 4th, 1861. Anticipating Alabama's immediate secession, Governor A.B. Moore ordered the state militia to seize federal property at Mount Vernon Arsenal, Fort Morgan, and Fort Gaines, effectively putting Mobile Bay in Confederate control.
And something else about this, too. John Floyd was the Secretary of War under James Buchanan. And John C. Breckinridge, who ends up a Confederate general, was the vice president. John Floyd, while he was Secretary of War, was secretly having materials, supplies, guns, ammunition, everything moved from northern storehouses and armories and forts to southern ones, knowing that if it came to it and the South seceded, that way all of that federal property would be in the South and they could get their hands on it. It's one of the reasons why he snuck out of Fort Donelson when they knew they were going to have to surrender, is because he figured that because of those actions, he was going to be tried for treason, which he might have been.
January 6th, a group of armed men barged into the federal arsenal at Apalachicola, Florida, and demanded the keys to the armory. January 10th, weeks before Louisiana's secession, state militia seized the U.S. arsenal at Baton Rouge on orders from the governor. The following day, they seized Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which guarded the mouth of the Mississippi. January 13th, armed Mississippians took forcible control of the unfinished federal fort on Ship Island in the Gulf. January 24th, Georgia militia seized the Augusta arsenal. February 8th, acting on orders from the governor, Arkansas militia volunteers seized the federal arsenal at Little Rock and escorted federal troops across March 6th, the Provisional Confederate Congress authorized President Davis to raise an army of 100,000 men for 12 months' service. April 12th, South Carolina militia fired on Fort Sumter. April 15th, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for 3 months' service to suppress the rebellion. Call me crazy, but all I see is Southern aggression.
Yeah, that's fair. Now, that doesn't change the fact that Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia did use Lincoln's call for volunteers as their as the primary straw that broke the camel's back in them deciding to side with the Confederacy, because slavery was not nearly as integral a part of their economy as it was in what they call the Cotton States. So they were willing to find a compromise. That doesn't mean that anything he just said is wrong. The South was absolutely preparing for war, but they didn't want war. What they wanted was to be left alone and to be able to secede in peace. So they weren't going to attack the North, but they were preparing to defend themselves in the event that it came to a war in order to be able to have their independence.
You yellow-bellied horse thief! We raided those armories and forts because we needed weapons, and plenty of them, to facilitate our peaceful and equitable separation from the Union. Good thing we did, too, for soon after the war started, the tyrant Lincoln showed his true colors. He suspended habeas corpus illegally and jailed his political enemies without any charges. What do you call that except despotism of the highest order?
I call that pretty typical for a 19th century wartime government. Personally, I agree with you. Suspending habeas corpus during domestic emergencies is a very, very slippery slope, but it is constitutional. Article 1, Section 9 forbids the suspension of habeas corpus except in cases of invasion or rebellion.
But in 1861, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney challenged Lincoln on that exact point, arguing that the legislature alone had that power, as the framers of the Constitution clearly implied, and not the president.
That's true, but initially Lincoln only suspended habeas corpus along rail lines leading to Washington, D.C., and as he pointed out in his public response to Taney, he did it to make sure that those rail lines were kept intact.
So, yeah, think of Lincoln's situation here. I'm not defending what Lincoln did. Like I said earlier, I think Lincoln severely bent the Constitution to win the war. It's understandable. It doesn't make it right. But I think even he knew that it probably was marginal in terms of its constitutionality at best. But think of where Washington, D.C. is. It's surrounded by two southern slave states. Maryland, is kind of not really southern, but it's below the Mason-Dixon line, and it is a slave state. Virginia actually seceded, and that's right across the river. You could see Robert E. Lee's house, from Washington, D.C., right there across the river. So while he watches Virginia secede, he used force to make sure that Maryland didn't secede. And so he was using troops to secure Maryland. And if he had to arrest a bunch of Maryland political people to do that, he was willing to do that.
Without them, Congress wouldn't be able to physically get to D.C. to convene. And by the way, when he did suspend habeas corpus for the whole country in 1863, he did it with full congressional approval.
Oh, that is just so typical of you bootlicking Yankees. You have no appreciation for personal freedom. I bet you'd vote for Palpatine. We Confederates, on the other hand, know the meaning of liberty.
And it's funny because, I don't know what he's going to talk about next, but Jefferson Davis lamented the fact that he didn't have the powers that the central government in Washington had. In fact, he ran into some real issues in conducting the war because of the states' rights issues that led the Confederacy to secede in the first place. He ran into issues with the governors of several southern states who would not cooperate with the central government in Richmond, and he found himself kind of wishing he had that same strong central government, which is interesting since that's why they broke away, or at least they argued why they broke away.
Yeah, about that. The restriction of civil liberties in the Confederate States was actually way worse than it ever was up north. The Confederate Congress also suspended habeas corpus. Twice. They passed the Alien Enemies Act, which allowed the government to arrest anyone who didn't declare themselves as a loyal citizen of the Confederacy. They passed the Sequestration Act, which allowed the government to seize private property. They forbade civilian travel, prohibited the sale of liquor, and most famously instituted an extremely unpopular Conscription Act, the first such draft in American history. Again, all pretty typical actions for a wartime government, but you don't really have a leg to stand on when you prop up the Confederacy as this shining beacon of freedom especially when you take into account the tyranny that's inherent in the institution of slavery.
I can't argue with anything he just said. I have to agree 100% with all of it.
Slavery, slavery, slavery. Always you with the slavery. Well, you'll be just devastated to learn that your Lord and Savior Lincoln didn't give a damn about slavery and said so. And I quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. If I could save the Union by not freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that."
So there's a difference between political reality and personal feelings. Lincoln, by 21st century standards, which I admit are completely unfair, and I am totally opposed to trying to judge people, from 1860 on our 21st century understanding of things. But that said, by today's standards, Abraham Lincoln was a white supremacist, as were most of the people in the Union government. Lincoln never saw black people as equals, and he tried very hard to push the fact that he didn't. I shouldn't even say that he didn't see them as equals so much as he understood how difficult it was going to be for them to be equal in a post-slavery world. So they tried to buy up land in Central America. They tried to send to recolonize Africa. Monrovia, Liberia was a place that we had set up colonies. And he wanted to get the freed slaves to go there because he felt that they would be better off. He felt that white people were never going to accept them as equals, and he even saw in his own heart some of that same type of feeling. So it was a political reality that he knew he was not in a position to be able to free slavery, and he was going to do whatever he could to preserve the Union, regardless of what that looked like. That doesn't mean that he didn't change over the course of the war.
"And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others in bondage, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union."
Ah, yes, the quote from the Greeley letter. Trouble is, you've taken it completely out of context. Lincoln wrote that as a public response to an editorial in the New York Tribune that criticized him for not taking more decisive action against slavery. It's worth noting that when Lincoln wrote that response, he actually had a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation already written and was just waiting for an opportunity to put it into effect.
So remember, Lincoln is elected as the head of the Republican Party, which was born in the 1850s as a abolitionist party. Lincoln himself did not run as an abolitionist, but most of the most prominent and vocal members and powerful members of his party were abolitionists. People like Thaddeus Stevens, people like Salmon Chase and Seward, and all of these people who thought they should have been elected president instead of him. So he is balancing his personal feelings with what he's doing in the war. He's got people who are much more radical when it comes to abolition than he is, demanding that he take advantage of the war as an opportunity to free the slaves. But he also has to recognize that he can't lose Kentucky and Maryland and Missouri over the issue of slavery. And if he goes just completely abolishing slavery, he loses all of those states to the South and probably loses the war. So he's balancing all of that, and in his brilliance, he handled it perfectly.
And of course he emphasized saving the Union. Most of the North was intensely racist during the Civil War, and as president, Lincoln had to placate both white supremacists and ardent abolitionists. That was Lincoln's constant struggle throughout his presidency.
Yep.
The purpose of that letter was to soften public opinion. Lincoln was emphasizing that he would put the immediate needs of the nation over his own personal preferences, and his preference was ending slavery for good. I notice you didn't include the concluding remarks that Lincoln made in that same letter.
"I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free."
There you
Though
go.
Lincoln personally abhorred slavery, he initially refused to infringe on slaveholders' constitutionally guaranteed property rights. Ending slavery was not his top or most immediate priority during the war, but it was a priority. In 1862, he repeatedly reached out to the border states to try to get them to favor compensated emancipation. And lest we forget, it was Lincoln's staunch opposition to expansion of slavery of any kind into the territories that caused the secession crisis in the first place.
Yep.
So your master may not have been pro-slavery per se, but he was still a filthy racist. As he once said, I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Yes, he said that in the fourth debate with Stephen Douglas on September 18th, 1858. Remember, every 19th century politician had to contend with a voting base made up largely of white supremacists.
Yep.
Lincoln was trying to quell some potentially catastrophic rumors that he was in favor of amalgamation, or the mixing of the races. If it got out that he was in favor of equal rights, he wouldn't get elected to anything in America.
But you have no real evidence confirming he believed anything different.
You're right, but it's kind of ironic. You have to admit that you Confederates, who are normally so suspicious of Lincoln and of the federal government, are just willing to take the president's word on this.
You just shut up.
It's like you just dredge up these quotes without taking even a little bit of time to research or comprehend their contexts. Both are clear examples of political grandstanding. Politicians lie. They exaggerate. They try to appeal to as many people as possible.
Absolutely
Progressive
right.
politicians in particular lie about how committed they are to progressive ideas all the time.
And, you know, that's all very reasonable. It does not mean that Abraham Lincoln would not have fought for full equality for the former slaves in the post-war world, just as Grant fought for them with the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to black males. Of course, that's a whole other issue in the South, where they were systematically denied the exercise of those rights in the post-war world. But you have to give Lincoln room to have grown with what was politically practical. It sucks that we have to think of it that way, that Lincoln couldn't just do what he thought was right. But you know, if he'd have gone after what was right, like Thaddeus Stevens, for example, wanted to, they would have lost everything, and then they would have gained nothing. So by pushing things slowly and going with public opinion on things, he was able to increasingly move the country in the right direction.
I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman.
I do not support gay marriage, but I support a very strong version of civil unions.
This ruling will strengthen all of our communities by offering to all loving same-sex couples the dignity of marriage across this great land.
That's a perfect example of where you have President Obama standing for one thing, and as the political landscape changes, as public opinion changes, as opportunities present themselves, a position can change. And we've all done that. None of us have the exact same opinions that we did 20 or 30 years ago. I know a lot of you guys weren't born yet or old enough to remember those things, but for those of us who were, I have very different views on a lot of things now at 43 than I did when I was 23 or 13. That's part of maturity, is growing and learning and understanding and having your eyes open to things so that your opinions can change. That's the sign of wisdom and maturity, that you're able to do that.
Just because Obama lied about the gays does not mean
Didn't
that
lie.
Lincoln lied about the blacks.
He changed.
Fair enough.
You know, many free staters wanted their territories to be whites-only havens. Oops! Not supposed to talk about that.
Yes, and speaking of Lincoln, throughout much of his political career, he was in favor of colonization, which would have entailed freeing American slaves and then sending them off to a colony in Africa. Which, yeesh. It was a proposed solution to the main argument against abolition at the time, which was that it would be impossible to integrate blacks into American society.
And the fact is that a lot of white Northerners, their biggest issue with freeing the slaves had nothing to do with what they thought about slavery itself. They may have been opposed to slavery, but they also looked at it kind of as, they're going to take my jobs, they're going to do it cheaper. Without getting into modern politics, I guess some of the same arguments that might be made about immigration from Mexico today. Just the argument that it's cheap labor that's going to compete for my job when all these people are suddenly freed. And so it was very personal and very selfish in a lot of ways, I guess, because people were more concerned about how it affected them than how it affected a person who might gain their freedom.
And that's horrifying.
But
But at the time, that was a very anti-slavery position. Now, we can argue about whether to judge Lincoln by the standards of racism in the 19th century or the standards of racism today, but the fact that he consistently fought against slavery is beyond dispute.
Yep.
So what if he did? It doesn't change the fact that after the Emancipation Proclamation made freeing the slaves a war aim, average Yankee soldiers deserted in the thousands.
And
So
that
did they-
forced the United States to pass a conscription act of their own.
And Confederate soldiers deserted in equal, if not larger, numbers. Desertion was a major issue on both sides.
Which famously led to the New York City draft riots,
Yep.
one of the ugliest episodes in Civil War history. But focusing purely on the undeniable white supremacy of Northerners during the war diminishes the significance of the sizable minority of abolitionists in the North. Now, it's important to differentiate here between an anti-slavery position and an abolitionist one. Most Northerners before the war were anti-slavery,
Yeah.
but they either wanted to contain it and allow it to go extinct on its own, or they wanted to gradually free the slaves with compensation to slave owners. Abolitionists took it a step further. They wanted to see the immediate, unconditional emancipation of all black Americans. New England was the hotbed of abolition at the time and was home to its most famous and influential advocates. When John Brown's raid failed in 1859, most Northerners viewed him as a lunatic, a total psycho.
Yep.
But abolitionists like Henry David Thoreau successfully changed public opinion, and pretty soon Brown was being regarded as a martyr and a hero. It's in the song, right? John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. John
Really don't
Brown's
have to give
body
us a
lies
performance,
moldering
Billy
in
Yank.
the grave. John Brown's body lies moldering in the
must
grave,
insist.
but his
Stop
soul
with
goes
that
marching
damn noise.
on. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Shut up.
Glory,
Stop
glory,
singing. Stop that damn noise.
hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. And his soul goes marching on. And by the end of the war, many Union soldiers did consider their cause to be abolitionists.
Yeah.
This was mainly because of the large number of contraband slaves that would follow Union armies wherever they went. And these Yankee boys, many of whom had never been to the South in their lives,
Yeah, a lot of these guys had never seen slavery. Slavery was something you heard about, but you didn't really see it firsthand. You know, when you see something firsthand, it changes how you view it. When I first went to Costa Rica and I saw the way that people lived in parts of Costa Rica, that was a part of the world and a way of living in the world that I had never experienced before, and it completely changed my view of a lot of things. That was true for these guys too. As they go into the South and they see slavery firsthand, it starts to change how they think about it.
were being confronted by the horrifying realities of slavery for the very first time. This hardened their hearts against that institution, and they said as much in their diaries and letters. Higher up, the logistical problems caused by this large number of escaped slaves forced commanders and politicians to take the idea of immediate abolitionism more seriously. So, by mid-war, freeing the slaves wasn't just a moral imperative, it was also a practical necessity.
Well, you Yankees are just uncultured and basically miserable. That's the main difference between us. As our glorious President Jefferson Davis once said in a speech at the Mississippi State Capitol,
Our enemies are a traditionless and a homeless race. From the time of Cromwell to the present moment, they have been disturbers of the peace of the world. Gathered together by Cromwell from the bogs and fens of the north of Ireland and of England, they commenced by disturbing the peace of their own country. They disturbed Holland, to which they fled, and they disturbed England upon their return. They persecuted Catholics in England, and they hung Quakers and witches in America.
and clearly, the apple does not fall far from the tree. Oh,
Thou art an unlearned swine if thou dost truly believe that papists, Quakers, and witches ought to be shown mercy.
but religious freedom is one of the founding principles.
The devil's tongue wags in thy mouth. Those who love the Lord must needs separate themselves entirely from the professors of heathen faiths.
You know,
It's pretty good.
that's not a bad point. Mixed communities are a disaster. Usually it's just one community getting to the top anyway. Communities are better kept separate, or at least totally homogeneous.
Oh, 'tis so.
That way they can preserve their race, identity, and culture. If you ever noticed, mixed communities look just like New York City and have no identity. Bastardizing anything unique. Devilry! My God. I have returned. Lord, you have brought me to the Valley of Izion, where I live in the desperate sea and the ice, ending by mountains of sin, I behold your glory. You have no power here, which find the general.
The Bible?
I will draw thee out, Satan, as poison is drawn from a wand.
If I go, Johnny Rip dies.
Now we're on to Lord of the Rings.
Thou hast not killed me. Thou shalt not kill him.
The South is mine.
My work here is done. Okay, what happened? Hey man, are you okay? You fucking stupid to compare a Nazi to a Confederate. That's Yankee propaganda teaching you more
really.
lies. Good to have you back, buddy. Southerns treated African American maybe better in some cases. I know they were bad treated, but you think U.S. Grant treated them better them days. LMAO.
All right, so the only thing I want to say about that at the end is there are definitely some strong parallels between the South, especially the post-war, the Reconstruction South, and the early days of Germany in the 1930s as Hitler rose to power. It's scary. I mean, freed slaves were absolutely treated worse in many cases than Jews were in the 1930s in Germany. That is not a stretch. Do some study on what was happening in 1866, 67. Thousands of former slaves being killed for attempting to vote, for attempting to just live peacefully. It was ugly. It was really ugly. In some ways, life was worse for them for a while after slavery than when they had been slaves. Now, please don't misinterpret what I'm saying, because they were owned by other people. So no matter how good they were treated by people in the South, they were still owned by other people. And there's no getting around that. You can never argue someone was treated well by someone who owned them. My great-great-great-grandmother was born into slavery. She was a slave until she was a teenager. And she actually had a daughter also born into slavery. And so, you know, it's not much of a connection in my family, but I know that no matter how well she was treated by the people that she was owned by, she was still owned by them. And so what I mean by saying it was worse for them is that they were being systematically murdered after the war. So it's a difference of being owned versus having your life taken away. Neither one's okay. Neither one should have happened, but that was the reality that they faced. And you want to see a little glimpse of that. Watch the movie Kingdom of Jones, or Free State of Jones, it's called. I think they called it the Kingdom of Jones, really, with Matthew McConaughey. And you'll see a little bit of that aftermath. It's ugly. It's an ugly part of our history. No getting around that. So let me know your thoughts about all that. By and large, I agree with mostly everything he said. I expected to find a lot more that I would take issue with, because I know he's also got one where he talks about gods and generals being Southern propaganda, which until I hear his reasonings on the surface, I don't agree with. So I know there are going to be some things I disagree with him on, but by and large, that was well researched, well thought out, and definitely backed by the facts. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Drop a like if you would. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you again next time with another episode. Thanks for watching.